So question for you. Who hates being new at something? Who absolutely hates being new at something? I'm surprised at how few hands I see, because I think if we're being completely honest, a lot of us would not be fans of being new at something. That's why we struggle with change, because change in a lot of ways is simply getting used to a new way of doing things. And when you're new at something, it's awkward, it's a struggle, and you never feel like you're going to get any better at it. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but this is the first church where I have served as the lead or solo pastor. And let me tell you, as much as I value my seminary education, there are some things about this job that you can only learn through experience. I've stumbled in the face of challenges, I've made rookie mistakes, but frankly, that's just part of being new. That's why they're called rookie mistakes. Everyone who ever got good at anything or achieved anything had to start somewhere, and the start was typically pretty awkward and stumbling and clumsy. We're in our third week of our Lenten series, Flawed But Faithful. We're looking at significant and relatable moments from the life of Simon Peter, Jesus' most prominent disciple. In him, we get an honest look at a regular human being who chooses to follow Jesus. And I think we might be surprised to find just how human a hero of the faith like Peter can be. And if we're honest with ourselves, we at various times in our lives can relate to Peter's feelings, actions, and reactions. Now today we're going to be looking at 3 different significant moments with Peter that happened one right after another in rapid succession. First, Jesus predicts the amazing ways in which God plans to use Peter. And then we watch as Peter takes his first stumbling steps toward the role that Jesus had in mind for him. It all begins when Jesus and the disciples stop in the area of Caesarea Philippi. It's an area to the north of the Sea of Galilee near a mountain called Mount Hermon. There's a natural spring in a cave at the base of Mount Hermon that had long been used as a place of worship for the Greek god Pan. Almost 20 years before Jesus was born, King Herod built a temple near that cave in honor of Caesar Augustus, who upon his death had been declared a god by the Roman Senate. Furthermore, just like the Sea of Galilee, the spring of water in the cave was seen as yet another entrance to the underworld, Hades, the abode of the dead. So this place was a site of pagan worship, a site of emperor worship, and even a place associated with the abode of the dead itself. And it was at that place that Jesus decided to ask his disciples a question. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Now, the term the Son of Man is the most common way that Jesus refers to himself in the Gospels. And the expression can simply mean a human being, but Jesus is referring to the use of the term in the Old Testament book of Daniel. Here's the passage where Daniel uses the term Son of Man. "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." By using the term Son of Man, that's who Jesus was saying he was. But it was subtle. Not many would have made that connection to the passage in Daniel. So Jesus was being subtle about who he was because the time hadn't come yet for Jesus to openly declare who he was. To openly declare that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man foretold in Daniel's vision, would be to put an even bigger target on his back than he already had. The Jewish religious leaders took issue with Jesus' teachings, but he was popular among the people, and they really didn't have anything to nail him for. And the Romans couldn't care less about some wandering rabbi, but if he had declared himself the Messiah, the long-awaited king of the Jews, they would have seen him as a political threat. So Jesus was trying to subtly hint who he was without coming out and saying it. But Jesus was curious. What conclusions were people drawing about him on their own? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So the people were either comparing Jesus to these great prophets, or they believed that Jesus was one of these prophets raised from the dead by God. Even Herod Antipas wondered if Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead, and it was believed that Elijah would make some kind of appearance before the Messiah came. So these conclusions were not totally out of left field. And then Jesus makes the question personal. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? And that is a question that every living person who learns of Jesus must answer. And your answer reveals much about you, perhaps even what life after this life will look like for you. When Jesus asked this at Caesarea Philippi, guess who answered first? Simon Peter. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Peter believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the long-awaited king who the Jews believed would restore Israel to its former glory, drive out their Roman oppressors, and bring the people back to God. By calling Jesus the Son of God, Peter probably didn't mean it in the sense that you and I know it today. We believe it in the sense that the angel Gabriel meant it. We believe that Jesus was and is the fullness of God in human form. But for Peter, he might not have meant it that way. You see, it wasn't unusual to refer to a king as a son of God, not even for Israel. One of the royal psalms we talked about earlier this winter compares the relationship between God and a human king to a father-son relationship. In Israel, the king was considered God's son by adoption. Now, you'll recall I said earlier that Caesar Augustus was declared a god by the Roman Senate after he died. And that made his son Tiberius, the emperor in Jesus' day, the son of a god. But Peter called Jesus the Son of the living God. Peter was intentionally implying that he believed Jesus had greater authority than anyone, including the Roman emperor, because he was not the son of a dead God, but of the living God. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Now you'll recall that Peter was actually a nickname given to Simon by Jesus. It means rock, and it's not like a pebble or a stone, but like a solid mountainside or bedrock underneath soil. Jesus says that on this rock, he would build the church, his spiritual community of followers. Our brothers and sisters in the Roman Catholic Church see this as Jesus installing Peter as the first pope. And indeed, Peter did end up being the first Christian bishop. But we Protestants tend to believe that the rock Jesus was talking about was not so much Peter himself as his confession of who Jesus was. Historically speaking, both are true. Peter was the most prominent leader of the early church, and the church was built upon the confession that Jesus is Lord. And standing right in front of a cave, many believe to be the entrance to Hades, Jesus declares that the church Peter would be instrumental in founding, the church that would be built on the lordship of Jesus Christ, would be stopped by nothing, not even death and hell itself. Then after Jesus affirms Peter's confession of authority, he adds, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So Jesus is extending his authority to his disciples. And just to be clear, the you to whom Jesus is giving these keys is not just Peter, it's all of the disciples of Jesus. In standard English, we use the word you, whether we're referring to an individual or to a group. Of course, in the South and parts of the Midwest, you find words like y'all and yuns when referring to a group. Well, the Greek word used here is the Greek equivalent of y'all. I will give y'all the keys of the kingdom. And by the way, that is indeed how my Greek professor taught that to me. I went to seminary in Kentucky, of course. Jesus is the King of Kings and the ruler over both the natural world and the spiritual realm, and he is saying that he would share that authority with his followers. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. It's still not time to reveal who Jesus is to the world yet, but that time would come. And since the disciples have taken a huge spiritual step, Jesus believes that they're ready to hear what will happen when the time comes for him to reveal to the world who he is. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Now that they understand that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, surely they can handle this news, right? Often God does that with us too. We take a huge spiritual step, we make some huge spiritual breakthrough, and Jesus gives us something new to process, something new to work through, or some new challenge to tackle. But the same Peter who had just taken a huge spiritual step by declaring his belief in Jesus now starts to doubt him. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. You see, in Peter's mind, this isn't supposed to be the fate of the Messiah. The Messiah is supposed to rise up, be made king, overthrow the Romans, restore Israel, not suffer and die. How often have you had your assumptions and beliefs challenged like Peter did in that moment? Peter reacts emotionally, and that's usually our reaction too. That sometimes the truth is more subtle or complicated or altogether different from what we thought. Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Jesus had already been tempted 3 years earlier to take the easy way, to gain his crown without the cross. And now Peter, well-meaning as his intentions might have been, was being used by Satan to tempt Jesus yet again. There's another thing that happens to us sometimes. We sometimes finding ourselves standing for our own beliefs and assumptions only to find ourselves opposing what God wants. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciples must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done." Jesus has great authority and is willing to share that great authority, but we have to have God's interests in mind before our own. even if that requires discomfort, struggle, and even suffering along the way. Hold on too firmly to the things you care about in this life, including your very self, and you'll ultimately lose them. On the other hand, hold on firmly to God and His purposes, and He will ensure that the things that truly matter most to you, you will never permanently lose. The words of C.S. Lewis, aim for earth and you lose it. Aim for heaven and you get earth thrown in. Then Jesus makes a promise. He says, truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom. After 6 days, Jesus took with Him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And His clothes became as white as the light. Just then, there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. 6 days after His exchange with Peter, Jesus takes him, James, and John up on a mountain where they get to see Him in His fullness. They see Jesus not as the carpenter from Nazareth, not as the dusty traveling rabbi, but as Daniel's Son of Man, the true Son of the living God. And instead of simply taking in the moment, guess who feels he has to say something? Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Peter can't just sit still and take in the vision before his eyes. He feels like he has to do something. Sometimes we have that problem too. Yes, our faith is meant to call us to action, but if we're not stopping long enough to hear from God, we might find that action to be different from or even opposed to what God really wants from us. While He was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my Son, whom I love. With Him I am well pleased. Listen to Him. God the Father tells Peter that he does need to do something, and it's not build some tents. He says, listen to Him. God the Father affirms what Peter confessed about Jesus earlier, and He tells Peter and the others how they're supposed to respond. Listen. And remember what your parents and teachers told you. There's a difference between hearing and listening. If you're listening, what you hear doesn't stop with your ears. It becomes a part of you. It seeps into your mind and heart, changing you from the inside out until you behave differently. That's the way that the Father was calling Peter and the other disciples of Jesus, including us, to listen to Jesus. Peter had his moments when he didn't quite get it right. He had a moment when he spoke and acted when he should have been silently listening. He had a moment when he held so tightly to his own beliefs and assumptions that he challenged the very one he believed carrying divine authority. And yet Jesus said that it was on the foundation of Peter's faith that the church, the community under the lordship of Jesus Christ, would be built. Peter didn't always get it right, but he started with what mattered most, his faith in Jesus. And he learned. He grew. He didn't stay a rookie. He didn't stay a novice. And God used him powerfully. And if we start with that same faith and commit to learn both from those lessons of those like Peter who have gone before us, and learn from our own experiences of walking with God, we too can be used powerfully in building the kingdom of God, against which not even the gates of hell itself can stand.